Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And what we're going to discuss in this lecture is we bring actual science to Hissarlik, the presumed site of ancient Troy. And this lecture is going to involve American archaeologists re-examining the wreck of Hissarlik left after Heinrich Schliemann and exactly what happens to ancient landforms over thousands of years. And there's the outline right up above me. So let's go ahead and get started. And all of this is in service to a single huge question. And there it is right over there. And the question is, what was the treasure of Priam? What was that thing? Did the Trojan War actually happen? What is the relationship between the treasure and the Trojan War? What does a scientific archaeology say about ancient Troy? What exactly was the treasure in antiquity? And what did it mean to the ancient Trojans? And what does the treasure of Priam, that thing right above me, what does it mean to modern archaeology? And we're going to answer this question at the end of this lecture. So be sure to keep this question kind of percolating in the back of your brain as we move forward. And of course, here is Heinrich and Sophie. Heinrich Schliemann showing off his very nice coat. And then, of course, Sophie Schliemann wearing the jewels of Helen from the treasure of Priam. And Schliemann's excavations at Hissarlik in 1871 to 1874 pretty much left the site a wreck. He dug in these canal diggers. He blew these huge trenches through the canals. He dumped his back dirt from one part of Hissarlik on the other parts of Hissarlik, contaminating the archaeological record across the site. Of course, he got kicked out of the country in 1874. And that was about it for Hissarlik. Schliemann had meant to return in 1890, but of course he died. And while there were a series of small excavations around the turn of the century, essentially Hissarlik was untouched until the 1930s. And people tended to buy into Schliemann's idea that it was the second stratum of Hissarlik, what becomes known as Troy II, that is the Troy of the Trojan War. Subsequent excavations, however, revealed that Schliemann, unsurprisingly, had missed a considerable amount of information. There was a series of excavations carried out by German archaeologists in the 1890s and in the 1900s. But it's really the excavations in the 1930s under Karl Blegan, and then later in the 2000s under Manfred Korpfmann, that have really fundamentally changed our idea about Hissarlik. And it is from these better archaeological investigations that we can actually answer the question, was there a Trojan War? The first of these cats is Karl Blegan there on the upper left. 1887 to 1971, University of Cincinnati. He was a real archaeologist. He's not an antiquarian. He's not digging for treasure. He is trying to extract information from the archaeological record. And it is Blegan who largely cleans up a lot of Schliemann's mess. He substantially improved the site. He did a pretty good job in reconstructing the site. And even though he quit working there in the, I think in the 1950s, his students continue on into the 1960s. And in fact, it's in the 1960s that they make one of the great discoveries of the area. That is the revised stratigraphy of Hissarlik, right up above me. And I want to show it to you for two reasons. One, I want you to compare Schliemann's stratigraphy there on the left to the stratigraphy worked out by Blegan and those other Germans in the early 1900s. I mean, just compare. That is what archaeologists do. Studying the discrete layering of occupations, putting together and reconstructing the archaeological record. That is what antiquarians and treasure hunters do. merely a chart, and it misses a lot of information. The second reason I want to show you this is look at that stratigraphy above, and you get to see exactly how difficult doing archaeology at Hissarlik actually is. You can see those huge trenches that Schliemann blasted through the site, and some of them are tilted, and the archaeological record is in an angle. Very difficult to work at Hissarlik. Blegen recalibrates the sequence of Hissarlik. He determines there are not 5 cities inside Hissarlik. There are 9. And he combines the research of Schliemann, Wilhelm Dorpfmann, and he confirmed that there's not 5 cities. There are 9 cities inside Hissarlik. Each city was, something happened to each city. It was destroyed, and then its successors built directly on top of the old ruins and created a 9 layers of city. And even then, some of the cities can be internally divided. So there are many cities in Hissarlik, not the 5 that Schliemann thought. Schliemann missed 4 major cities. Blegen argued Hissarlik is Troy. And Blegen's sequence is above. I mean, it's in German, but there's Blegen's sequence above, a different color-coded as you look through Troy's 1 through 9. And this is how the large-scale stratigraphy at Hissarlik is organized today, by Roman numeral. Troy 1 going all the way to Troy 9. Now, Blegen says, look, Troy 7 and Troy 8 and Troy 9, those are Iron Age Greek and Roman Troys. We're not going to worry about them. They are much, much later. They are much more recent, and they're not going to factor into our questions about the Trojan War. So they're very interesting cities in and of themselves, but they're simply not germane to our research question here, which is about the Bronze Age Trojan War. Now, you have Troy's 1, 2, and 3. This is what's called maritime Troy. Maritime Troy is an early culture that's oriented to several islands in the Aegean Sea, centered on what appears to be very thriving civilization based on the Isle of Lesbos. And it's related to a very complex civilization up on Crete, the Minoan civilization. And of the maritime Troys, Troy 1, 2, and 3, the largest and most elaborate of these Troys is Troy 2. Troy 2 is called the city of Megarons, not because it's named Megaron, but it contains these very large structures that are called Megarons, these buildings. A Megaron is a type of a building. And Troy 2 is composed of these large Megarons inside the central citadel of the city itself. So what is a Megaron? That is a Megaron. We have an architectural drawing above me and a plan map on the left. What is a Megaron? A Megaron is basically a type of common throne room for the head of a noble family. So it's this large colonnaded hall, often with an open space in the middle and a large fire pit that was always kept going. And during the day, the Megaron was basically an audience chamber and activity room for the very height of the noble family. The head of the noble family would sit on one side of the Megaron in a throne or a chair and would entertain visitors or guests, renters, supplicants. All along the edges of the hall, people would be engaged in various working. Women would be weaving. Men would be feeding dogs. Men would be discussing businesses or making deals. And in the evening, the noble family itself would retire to their private chambers, and people would sleep along the sides of the Megaron. So it was essentially this large communal noble house. And it was a structure where the members of the noble house could get together and discuss their various issues and concerns and problems and advantages. That's a Megaron. These things are very popular in ancient Greece, these large single-roomed structures. and they make very large, very impressive architecture. Indeed, the size and the degree of elaboration and how big and elaborate your Megaron is reflects on how wealthy and powerful your family is. So your family wants a really huge, impressive Megaron. And Megarons are very nice and they're very impressive. But Blagan says maritime Troy is not the Troy of the Trojan War. Okay? He says no. Blagan argued that the Troy of the Trojan War had to be in the middle. Troy 4, 5, 6, or 7. One of those ancient cities. So Troys 4 through 7 are the late Bronze Age Troys. These are very big Troys. They're much, much larger than Troy 2. Blagan argued that Troy 6 is the largest, the wealthiest, and the most powerful of these Bronze Age cities. Troy 6 had massive fortifications, and Troy 6 was destroyed. It was partially demolished. In fact, Troy 6 looks like it had been massively destroyed in a single destructive event. And this event took place right around 1400 BC. And it coincides with a known geological event that roughly in around 1400 BC, a massive earthquake rocked the region. Blagan argued Troy 6, the largest and richest of these Bronze Age Troys, Troy 6 was destroyed in this cataclysmic earthquake. And ruins dating to the same era can be found all around the Aegean Sea, and indeed in different parts of the Mediterranean. And so Troy 6 was destroyed. And then you have Troy 7. And Troy 7 was very, very problematic. It was very, very complicated. So Blagan actually divided Troy 7 into two different sequences, Troy 7A and Troy 7B. Troy 7A is large and is a massively fortified city. Basically, Troy 7A is the attempt by the Trojans to rebuild Troy 6. Troy 6 was destroyed in an earthquake. Troy 7A is an attempt to rebuild Troy 6. But Troy 7A itself only lasted, I think it only lasted 150 years. And then it was destroyed by a massive fire. And there's a massive destructive event enveloped Troy 7A. But the difference is, we know that Troy 6 is associated with this known earthquake. Troy 7A was destroyed, and there is no evidence of a really big earthquake taking place. Additionally, Blagan discovered large numbers of military weapons buried in the fire. These include bronze arrowheads and spear points that are inside some of these buried buildings, lying into or next to the wall. And those bronze arrowheads are particularly important. They are a style of bronze arrowhead that is produced in southern Greece. And of course, the name of southern Greece is Achaea. That's why the people there are called Achaeans. Troy 7A is destroyed in what Blagan argues is a military destructive event. And then the city sits idle for a while. Then the next city is called Troy 7B. Troy 7B is a very different city. It's very small. It's a very different settlement. The inhabitants of Troy 7B did not rebuild the old ruins. They simply pushed the burned old buildings over and built on top. And they don't rebuild old streets. They just push ruins into the streets and build new streets right on top. Troy 7B builds directly on top of the ruins of Troy 7A, but they don't follow the same city plan. They don't reoccupy the same buildings. They have completely different artifacts. They have different tools. They have an incredibly different style of pottery. They have different temples dedicated to different gods. Indeed, the people of Troy 7b are completely unrelated to the people of Troy 7a. The people of Troy 7b seem related to Bronze Age cultures in southeastern Europe from the Balkans. And this is why Troy 7b is generally called Balkanish Troy. So here's a question I'll ask you. What does this say about the people of Troy 7b that they made no attempt to rebuild their city? And that an entirely new group of people come in from mainland Europe, north of Greece, and build a completely new and very different city on top of the old ruins. Blagan argues, there's Blagan. Blagan argues, Troy 7a is the Troy of Homer, all right? And he argues that the evidence he uncovered points to a major destructive event taking place somewhere around 1000 BC. In other words, 200 years before Homer is supposed to write the Iliad. And Blagan argues that this destructive event was ultimately military in nature. Blagan argues that Schliemann is wrong. It is not Troy 2 that is the Troy of Homer. It is Troy 7a. I don't know why this is an A. Now, Blagan's excavations were interrupted by World War II, and this whole time the Russians sack Berlin and disappear the treasure of Priam for 50-odd years. And this places a big hold on the archaeology of Troy. And I think Blagan returns in the 50s, but his excavations are never very large in nature, if I'm not mistaken. It is the students of Carl Blagan that return to the site in the 1950s and 60s that make an incredibly fascinating discovery. And they are excavating not at Hissarlik, which is kind of a mess, but they decide to do a geological study of the land around Hissarlik. And they reveal that the land around Hissarlik didn't always look that way. And they published this series of maps at the top. And if you look at the one in the upper left, that's what the land looked like around 4500 BP, so roughly 2500 BC. In other words, it wasn't this nice rounded landform, but instead this jagged coastline. Part of what is now a flat level plain was open water. It was the Aegean Sea. And the water went all the way up to maritime Troy, Troy's 1, 2, and 3. They were a walled city directly on the water, with a mighty river that was feeding into this huge bay. But over time, the river is feeding silt into this large, shallow bay. And it is slowly starting to silt up over the centuries. By the time we get to late Bronze Age Troy, which is the map in the center, much of that huge bay has largely contracted. And as the coastline gets farther away, the river Scamander, would have been large. It would have been very, very impressive. It would have been a big, powerful river feeding in to a large open bay. Now, it would have been a shallow bay because the whole bay is slowly silting up. But still, the geologists, the students of Carl Blagan, determined that if we go back in time, if we look at the geology and we go back to 1000 AD, there would have been a river on the eastern side of it would have been a city on the eastern side of a broad plain with a huge bay to the north and a mighty river running through the middle. But that river was carrying silt, and it was eroding the mountains to the south. And slowly this huge bay silted up. And then you get to the Roman era, right up above me on the upper right, and you see the large bay has almost completely vanished, leaving a city that was once on the coast of the Aegean Sea, easily miles and miles inland. And The mighty river Scamander is now just too far from the ocean. It in turn dries up and turns into a shallow, muddy little creek. In other words, the area looked like Homer's description in 1000 BC, not like it does today. And that's science up into Manfred Korfmann's renewal of excavations in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. And that's what we'll look at in part 2.